Sudan's central Darfur state has declared a state of emergency after gunmen opened fire on mediators tasked with settling an intercommunal dispute, killing 24 people. Michael Atit reports from the Sudanese capital, Khartoum.
After an emergency meeting of the State Security Committee on Sunday night, Central Darfur Governor Saad Adam Babikir issued an order declaring a state of emergency in all parts of Central Darfur for a period of 1 month. The decision came after gunmen attacked a reconciliation committee sent to mediate a dispute between the rival Wadi Saleh and Bandasi communities. According to locals, the mediators were accused of favoring one side, sparking anger from the other side. The governor said the attack on Wedelmahi locality killed at least 24 people and left 41 others wounded. In the order, Governor Babikir stressed the need to preserve the security of the state and the safety of citizens. It banned all forms of gatherings in the two localities. Last week, the governor of Blue Nile State, Ahmed Al-Omda Badi, issued an emergency order also banning all public gatherings, events, and unlicensed activities. Intercommunal conflicts have been on the rise in Sudan since the military coup in October 2021. Pro-democracy protesters have kept up demands for the military to step aside and establish a civilian-led transitional government in the country. Mediation efforts by the UN and the African Union have yet to bear fruit. Michael Atit for VOA News, Khartoum, Sudan.
In Cameroon, health workers and diabetics are marching on World Diabetes Day, November 14th, today, to protest insecurity that is being blamed for a jump in deaths among diabetic patients. Health workers say Cameroon's separatist conflict and terrorism near the borders with Chad and Nigeria are preventing 70% of patients from being treated. Moki Edwin Kinzeka reports from Yaoundé, Cameroon.
Scores of diabetics and hospital workers braved a heavy downpour in Cameroon's capital Yaoundé on Monday to march against what they call abuse of diabetes patients' rights. The protesters say Cameroon's separatist conflict and Islamist militants on the borders with Chad and Nigeria are preventing diabetics from getting life-saving treatments. 45-year-old fish seller Pierre-Marie Loncy is among the protesters.
Le diabète, ce n'est pas une maladie qui peut nous tuer, mais c'est le stress qu'on nous donne.
He says many patients are dying of stress and lack of medication. Loncy says patients should not be restricted from going to hospitals in areas where there are conflicts, and hospitals should not be targeted by armed men. The government says Boko Haram militants in northern Cameroon and separatists in the country's west often attack hospitals and abduct health care workers. The latest, on November 4, saw 9 health workers abducted in the town of Batibo in Cameroon's northwest region. Authorities blame separatists who denied responsibility. Cameroon says many health workers have fled the fighting, which also makes delivery of hospital equipment and medication difficult. During a program on state radio Monday, health officials said the number of people who died of diabetes in the region's hospitals jumped from 260 last year to nearly 400 so far this year. But speaking on CRTV radio, the officials said most deaths occurred out of hospitals and went unreported. The officials said most diabetes patients arrive at hospitals at critical stages because fighting and insecurity prevented them from getting needed treatments. Cynthia Ngek is a medical staff member at Cameroon Baptist Convention Health Services who took part in the protest. He says most diabetic patients in the conflict areas cannot afford basic treatments such as insulin to manage their blood sugar.
Very few patients can afford doing basic blood glucose monitoring. There are very few facilities that have readily available drugs to meet these patients. Worsening the ongoing conflict, the quality of living has reduced, the cost of living has actually increased, and so people would want to fend more for their food than buy insulin or medications.
Cameroon's Ministry of Public Health said similar World Diabetes Day events took place near the northern border with Chad and Nigeria and in the English-speaking western regions. Anglophone separatists in Cameroon's western regions have since 2017 been fighting to break away from the French-speaking majority, citing second-class treatment. Cameroon's National Diabetes and Hypertension Program says about 9% of adults in urban areas live with diabetes, up from 6% in 2021. The program says 80% of patients are undiagnosed and only a quarter of people with known diabetes have adequate control of their blood sugar. Cameroon's government blamed lack of physical exercise made worse by the COVID-19 pandemic's isolation measures for increasing cases of diabetes. Moki Edwin Kinzaka for VOA News, Yaoundé, Cameroon.
The U.S. government has announced a reward of up to $10 million for information that helps find 3 leaders of Somali terrorist group Alshabab who are wanted for attacks that killed thousands of people in East Africa. Mohammed Yusuf reports from Nairobi, Kenya.
The U.S. government is asking the citizens of Somalia and the region to help trace Al-Shabaab leaders Ahmed Dirie, Mahat Karate and Jihad Mustafa. The 3 are accused of playing roles in several deadly terrorist attacks in Somalia and Kenya. U.S. Ambassador to Somalia Larry Andre, speaking in Nairobi Monday, said the new $10 million reward, double from the previous offer, will complement the Somali government's effort to defeat the Al-Qaeda-affiliated terrorist group.
Today, we announced the doubling of the reward offers for information leading to the capture of those leading Al-Shabaab. We also announced a new program aimed at disrupting Al-Shabaab's financial networks. Let me stress that this is in support of the announced strategy of the Somali government. So the Somali government's strategy is to contest the false religious ideology, to go after the finances, and to confront on the battlefield to liberate Somali communities.
Somali government troops and local militias are involved in a military offensive aimed at driving Al-Shabaab out of dozens of villages and towns in central Somalia. U.S. officials said arresting the Al-Shabaab leaders will disrupt the group's operations and safeguard the region's peace and prosperity. According to U.S. authorities, Ahmed Dirie, also known as Abu Ubaidah, is Al-Shabaab's top leader. He was seen in a video meeting fighters who carried out attacks at a U.S. military camp in Lamu County, Kenya in 2020. Mahat Karate is the group's deputy leader and has at least partial command over the Aminiyat, Al-Shabaab's security and intelligence wing. Also on the list is Jihad Mustafa, a military instructor and the leader of the foreign fighters in Somalia. Mustafa, a former resident of San Diego, California, functions as an intermediary between Al-Shabaab and other terrorist organizations. The deputy chief of mission at the U.S. Embassy in Kenya, Mark Dillard, said the reward covers information about illegal financial activities and businesses.
To further demonstrate our resolve to disrupt and dismantle Al-Shabaab's network, the United States, with the support of our Kenyan and regional partners, the United States is offering reward money for information that would lead to the identification and disruption of Al-Shabaab's revenue sources and funding streams. This includes information on Al-Shabaab's exploitation of local natural resources, on financial donors and facilitators, and on financial transactions.
Monday's announcement marks the first time the U.S. State Department's Rewards for Justice program has offered money for information on Al-Shabaab's financial networks. Mohammed Yusuf for VOA News, Nairobi.
So, just the basic conversation about global warming, which is the main thrust of this climate change conference, is that the level of the seas will rise, and cities and towns and even island nations will disappear. But water is related to every aspect. Either too much water can cause disasters, such as floods. This year we've seen unprecedented floods that in Nigeria and Pakistan and other countries that have killed more than 2,300 people in Nigeria and Pakistan alone. And then in other places, there's not nearly enough water. There are droughts, the worst drought in 40 years in the Horn of Africa, and people in Somalia are already dying from hunger because there is not enough food, because there is not enough water. And this drought's not limited to Africa. There's also droughts in the Middle East and in other continents. I mean, I've talked to farmers that say they're experiencing the worst drought there in Syria in 70 years. And Iraqis that are fleeing their homes because their marshlands are drying up and the farmland is no longer viable. And families in Libya that can no longer irrigate their farms, moving to cities and towns because they can't live where they're from anymore. So this issue of water impacts people's lives all over the globe and is at the very heart of the climate change issue.
Water, a blessing and a curse. Another theme was gender. What were some of the discussions on that topic?
This is interesting that today was, of the themes today, water and gender, that gender was one of the themes for the climate conference today. And for most of history, large decisions, international conferences, and important high-level discussions are usually done by men. And one of the things that was on the table today to discuss was not just that women are important, but that women should be included more, and that women should have their voices heard in high-level discussions on a regular basis. And one of the reasons why this is important is because they have found that women are disproportionately impacted by climate change. So one of the topics on the table today was African women. And if you're talking about rural women in general and women in rural Africa specifically, you find that they're disproportionately impacted by climate change to an extreme level because they're disproportionately working in fields like agriculture that are impacted by the environment. Another example, which seems small but it's huge in so many millions of women's and girls' lives, is water for the family. Usually in rural areas, in Africa and other places, when the family needs to travel, like an individual in the family needs to go someplace to collect water, clean water for the family to drink, it's usually women and girls that do it. So when an area dries up or a well dries up and somebody has to miss other parts of their life, specifically schools for young people, it's usually the females that have to travel sometimes for hours every single day just to get enough water for their families to drink. And this leads to so many other outcomes, the most obvious being the lack of education for rural girls because of this.
VOA's Heather Murdoch, thank you for your input.
Thank you so much.
The world's three largest rainforest nations, Brazil, Democratic Republic of Congo, and Indonesia, today formally launched a partnership to cooperate on forest preservation. Reuters news service reports that representatives of the three countries, which holds 52% of the world's tropical rainforest, signed the joint statement at talks in Indonesia ahead of the meeting of the Group of 20 Industrialized Nations, which begins tomorrow. The G20 talks coincide with the second and final week of the COP27 United Nations Climate Summit in Egypt. At COP27, Brazil's presidential environmental advisor Isabella Teixeira said Brazil would seek to get the involvement of other countries in the Amazon basin, which spans 9 nations. Thousands of climate activists are also at Sharm el-Sheikh for COP27. Patricia Kumbo, a young Kenyan, is among them. She has been named a land hero by the UN Convention to Combat Desertification for her efforts to protect land against the effects of climate change, especially in Africa. VOA's Carol Van Dam asked Kumbo what action she wants to see taken from the biggest polluters, including China and the US, at the end of COP27.
What I'm looking for this conference is to have solutions and, negotiations that are tailored towards financing nature positive solutions, because from where I sit, I understand that nature is able to deliver some of these crises. And when I'm talking about nature, I'm referring to land, because the land is the link between biodiversity, ecosystem, and also the link to climate crisis. So I'm looking at a conference that will give land a key priority, that will address land with all the importance that land has to us, and especially for communities that experience in drought, because we know from the land, we are fed from the land, all our basic needs are catered for, and especially it being an African COP, and it happening in Africa, where at a time when land degradation is at high, desertification and drought is very, very high. I'm seeing and looking and hoping that land will be given a priority, and that land will actually be recognized as one of the tools that needs a lot of resilience, because from the land there is prosperity, there is livelihood, there is peace, and there is resilience.
How do you see that working out, those specifics? If they were to write something in a document and saying, we agree to this, some of the more developed countries that are the biggest polluters, what do you want them to do?
First of all, we are looking at some commitment, and last time it was committed, the world leaders committed to restore 1 billion hectares. And I'm looking at the commitment of restoring 1 billion hectares, not from the negotiation or not from in the document, but actually implementing it, whereby every country will take ambitions to ensure this is implemented. Countries actually commit and ensure the NDCs, their nationally determined contributors, are well actually implemented on ground, and ensuring that we join hands to end corporate desertification, which is very, very huge in Africa.
Today is Gender Day at COP27. What is that all about?
Oh, yeah. Gender Day is one of themes that I'm passionate, or rather I was key to attend during the conference, because gender speaks to me. And today I can say I was disappointed. Even when you saw the world leaders, there were photos going around, and you saw the gender gap was missing. And also looking at the negotiators, you find 3/4 of negotiators are male. They are the male dominant. But to me, gender justice is climate justice, because without gender justice, we will all live in crisis, because ever since time immemorial, women have cultivated, they have catered for the land, they have nurtured it, because land is their identity.
That was Patricia Combo, a youth activist attending COP27. She was speaking with VOA's Carol Van Dam from Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt. Zambia is seeking answers from Russia after a Zambian student who was serving a prison sentence in Russia ended up dying at the battlefront in Ukraine. Kathy Short reports from Lusaka, Zambia.
23-year-old Nathan Lemekani Nyirenda was serving a 9-year prison sentence in Russia after being convicted of drug possession in 2020. But Zambia's Foreign Minister Stanley Kakubo at a Monday news conference said the government was informed on November 9th that Nyirenda had died at the battlefront in Ukraine.
The Zambian government has requested the Russian authorities to urgently provide information on the circumstances under which the Zambian citizen serving a prison sentence in Moscow would have been recruited to fight in Ukraine and subsequently lose his life.
Zambia's foreign ministry says it learned that Nyirenda died on September 22nd in Ukraine, and that his remains were taken to the Russian border town of Rostov to be sent back to Zambia. Kakubo, who said he visited Nyirenda's family, said we'll communicate more details once the Russian authorities provide more information on the circumstances of his death. Nyirenda was studying nuclear engineering at the Moscow Engineering Physics Institute before his conviction. As Russia has struggled in its war against Ukraine, reports from Russia indicate authorities have been recruiting troops from prisons. One video circulated in September on social media showed President Vladimir Putin's ally, Yevgeny Prigozhin, who runs the controversial Wagner group of mercenaries. In the video, Prigozhin tells a large group of prisoners that their sentences would be commuted if they fight for Russia in Ukraine. Kathy Short for VOA News, Lusaka, Zambia.
Senegalese President Macky Sall is expected to meet with the President of China's Xi Jinping this week on the sidelines of the G20 summit in Bali, Indonesia. Sall is attending the summit as the head of the African Union. The summit opens tomorrow and runs through Wednesday. Among other topics at the G20, Sall is expected to discuss the issue of aid for Senegal and other developing nations as they battle climate disasters. Yesterday, a spokesman for South Africa's President Cyril Ramaphosa said his government will push to create a permanent seat at the G20 for the African Union. South Africa is the only G20 member from the African continent. The G20 group, 19 major economies, plus the European Union, to coordinate on economic and financial developments.